Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Oh, just going to turn my sound monitor down, otherwise you're going to get double sound. Welcome to today's webinar. So today we are talking all about city landscape and travel editing. So that is the task for us today. So before we get onto that, I'm just going to go forward and give you some introduction and some information on how the webinar works. So first of all, my name is David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, the maximum amount of time that we have allowed today is 60 minutes. So we won't go over that, but we'll probably use all of that. We shall see how we go. I am recording the webinar as well, so you'll be able to watch this on our Learning Hub in the next coming days. And normally it goes up on Thursday or Friday. You're very welcome to submit your questions at any time. We'll cover how to do that at the moment. There's also a colleague of mine, Andre, helping out as well. I just have to find him in the list. And there we go. So I'm just going to make Andre an admin as well. So if you have any questions, Andre will help you out in the chat too. Now, when we come to chat, just be aware that the chat is public. So everything you write in the chat is public and everybody will be able to see it. So just be aware of that and be nice to each other. If you want to ask a question, some of you have found it already, you can actually add your chat message to the Q&A. And that means it comes separately into a Q&A list, just in case if there's lots of you, of course, then the questions can get buried in amongst the chat. So asking a specific question is either best to add it to the Q&A, or indeed you can go directly to the Q&A tab and ask your question there as well. Now, if chatting and questions totally uninterest you, that's fine. You can give yourself a bit more space on screen by hiding the chat, or you can expand it out as well. All right, so, and as I've said before and in the waiting room, for those of you who are on Mac or PC, whoops, 1 second. For some reason, let's just, we were going to get another person's camera popping up, which was rather strange. So let's make sure we don't surprise poor Elizabeth and get her up on screen for some reason. So I just need to find her in the list. So that's never happened before. There we go. Elizabeth has gone. Don't worry. So for those of you on Mac, then it always makes much more sense to go for using Chrome or Firefox. All right. Okay, so without further ado, let us begin and we can get started. So, alrighty, let's switch to the screen, and so you should be able to see screen coming up now and Capture One as well. So what I've got, I mean, we're not going to be able to process all these shots today. But we try and get through as many as possible. I also haven't over-rehearsed it too much, which might be a dangerous tactic, let's see. But just trying to keep it as natural and fluid as possible and approach it as you would when you're sat in front of Capture One and you need to start processing images. So it's not over-rehearsed. We're going to approach this from real life as well. Okay, so let's just go back to the screen. And away we go. All right. So what should we go for first? Let's pick out a simple one here. Nice shot from my friend and photographer, Emily Teague. Let's hide my browser. So up in the view menu, we can say Command B, or just hide the browser here. So let's go for that. And let's have a look at this shot. Now, the first thing that I do personally when I come to editing is fix a couple of basic things, of course, but maybe even before this, that is to actually sort out the crop. So on this one, I'm probably just gonna squeeze the crop down on the top and middle. Now, incidentally, you can see that when I crop, the grid pops up, and what you might not have noticed is that there's actually a new tool called Grid down here in the Lens tool. So we added this in Capture One 12.1, and if you find that your grid is not following your crop, then you just need to turn this on, follow crop, like so, and then that means that the crop will follow your the grid will follow your crop. So that was something we changed in Capture One 12.1. So just be aware, if that's not behaving, that's now how it works. And there's a lot more options to help your composition. You can add a golden ratio, Fibonacci spiral, and so on and so forth. So that works much better now. It did in earlier versions of Capture One. Okay, so before we get on to anything else, we fix some basic things about the shot. Now, exposure wise, if anything, it's maybe slightly too dark overall, especially on the left-hand side of the shot. So we're just going to raise that a little tiny bit, but not too much. And looking at our levels, we've got a pretty nice even spread from shadows to highlights, which in general is what we're looking for. Now, personally, I always hit A for auto in the levels, and that will set my shadow and highlight points. Now, you can, of course, control this manually as well, and we're going to talk about how the levels work as we go throughout the webinar, and also what the numbers do up the top here, because there's a really good image where we can show how to use these numbers at the top, depending on the kind of look that you want. Now, pretty much this image looks pretty good out of camera. Now, the only thing that I would do is that obviously our subject is this guy in the middle, so we could of course crop out the right hand side, or we could just darken that down a little bit. Now, before I come to that, you'll notice I've just made myself an extra tool tab here, and just be aware, if you don't know how to do that in Capture One, you can right click and add yourself an additional custom tool tab. And the reason why I've done that is just to divide up my exposure tools a little bit. I run the screen at a lower than normal resolution, just so it's easier for you guys to see. And this way, by dividing up the tools, it just stops me opening and closing and so on. But on my normal display, on my 2K display, then I can fit everything in one tool tab. Okay, so what I might do with this one is on my layers, I'm going to make a new layer, and if we're smart, we're going to name our layers so we know what they're doing. So I'm going to call this grad right. And where my selection tools are, we're going to draw a linear gradient mask. So all that's G on your keyboard. And we're going to drag in from the right hand side, and this is going to make us a nice gradient mask over the right hand side. And the purpose of that is literally just to darken down that side a little. Now remember, M on the keyboard to hide and show the masks, like so. So M to hide and show mask. And all I want to do now is drop down the density. Now we could use exposure if we wanted to. But remember, what exposure does is that it will decrease the whole shot by the same amount. So all the densities by the same amount. So highlights, shadows, midtones are all going to be decreased. Now I don't really want the shadows to get any darker, because we don't want the shadows to block up. So instead of using exposure, a more sensible thing to use would be brightness. And what brightness is going to do is just take down the midtones a little bit. So it's not going to have quite so much effect on those darker tones. And it's only a subtle change, but it just means that we can balance the shot a bit better. So if I go to my background, I can open up exposure a bit more, just so it's a bit brighter on his face. Go back to my grad, and then let's just take that brightness down a bit more. Now if I want to change how the gradation is, then I can just hover back onto the shot, and you see the gradation tool lines pop back up, and then I can pull this grad over a bit more if I want to. Now, little known feature, if you haven't read about it or watched any of the tutorial videos, if you hold the Alt key down, we can actually make our grad asymmetric. So that means instead of the fall off being, if I press M on my keyboard, if you imagine on the far right hand line, we've got 100% of our mask. The middle line, it's dropped to 50, and by the last line it's dropped to 0. So that's the standard fall off. But if you hold your Alt key down, then we can change this to being asymmetric, like so. So now if I want to extend this out, I can have a slightly sort of harder fall off going from 100 to 0. It also means that, you know, I can play with the gradient mask like so, and then you can see exactly how it's changing. So I'm probably going to settle around there, something like that. And now if we turn our grad right off, you can see before and after. Maybe that's a bit too much, so I just up that brightness like so. Now going back to the background, let's just throw in a bit more clarity. And if you don't know the difference between the clarity and contrast, just remember that contrast adds or makes the shadows darker and the highlights brighter. So if we were to do it on this image, let's boost that up. Then if we overcook it sort of around his face, you know, around here, then it's looking a little bit too sort of dark and unpleasant. So we have to be mindful of contrast, not to push it too much. But if you want that extra mid-tone or mid-range pop, then it certainly makes a lot more sense to use clarity, because that only affects the mid-tones. So we can push clarity a little bit harder, maybe not this hard, and then that way we get a nice mid-tone pop, and we can still retain the details in our shadows and highlights and so on. So if we just zoom in on his face a little bit, we've got nice detail and sharpness. I might just up the structure ever such a tiny bit, and structure will just help our edge definition. So it's similar, well, sorry, dissimilar to clarity, in that clarity will affect, if you like, the contrast or the mid-tone contrast. Structure is just going to help give us a little bit more pop on the edge, like so. Okay, if I click on structure, then you can see before and after. So just clicking on the name just gives us that slight preview. So depending on your screen size, you might see a difference, but try yourself. Obviously, if we push it too hard, then it's going to look unpleasant. But on an environmental portrait, and we can see all the text on his taxi license here and everything, it looks pretty good. Last thing I might do is just a simple vignette like so. Okay, so remember, if you want to see before and after in Capture One, so up here in the top left hand corner we've got our reset button. If we hold down Alt and click on the reset button, then we can see before. So that's how it looked straight out of camera. Let go, and then now that we can see our after, of course. So really it's not a bunch of dramatic corrections, it was more a case of darkening off the right hand side a little bit and giving a bit more focus to our subject. So if we bring our browser back up, what we can also do if we want to see them side by side, let's do a new variant. So that's going to give us a virtual copy. I'll select these two, like so. Let's hide our browser, and then we can see, obviously, hopefully, the after at the top, or the after on the left-hand side, and the before on the right-hand side. All right, okay, so let's have a look at the Q&A. Just going to bring my face up on screen, if you can cope with that. Let's have a look. Oh, lots of questions, blimey. We probably won't be able to get through all of them. Let's have a look. Just trying to find the sort of common ones. Let's see. That's a good one. Ian says, do you have an example of when you would not want your grid to follow the crop? Actually, I don't. The only reason why it's in there, like not following the crop, is actually for a different application called Capture One Pro Studio, which is designed for e-commerce, and sometimes they use grids for layouts and so on. So it's more like a studio-based thing, or if you're shooting still life and you have to specifically align something and be consistent, but the crop might change, then it makes sense to have a grid that doesn't move. But for general photography, it doesn't make sense whatsoever. So generally the default is to have it on. Is there something to Lightroom solo mode? Yes. So if you want to auto collapse, if you look in the view menu, that's a really good question. It hasn't come up before. But if you look at in the view menu, I don't think my face is covering it. No, auto hide mode. So if we do that, then if you hover over on the left hand side, then the tools pop up. So if you prefer to have a more sort of full screen experience, then you can do so with the auto hide, and don't forget you can also have that on a keyboard shortcut. So Option Command T if you're on a Mac, that will be Control Alt T if you were on a PC. And don't forget, again, if you're on Lightroom, if you prefer to have your tools on the right, makes much more sense if you're used to it, then you can do so as well. All right, good one from Ali. In regards to grads and layers, what's the easiest way to copy a grad and retain the settings? In Lightroom, I can press a hotkey and copy a grad and retain the last edits. Well, what you can do in each tool, who was that? Ali, wasn't it? In each tool, you'll see a little up-down arrow here, like so. So if we were to, we've got both of these images selected. So if I wanted to copy the grad from this one to this one, all I do is click on the copy and say apply. And then that's just put that grad onto the next image. So it's that little up down arrow in the layers tool. Now that works for all the other tools as well. Okay, can I have two gradients on the same layer? That's a good idea. You can't, so each gradient has to be on its own layer, and the reason for that is because each gradient can have its own opacity adjustments and so on. You could apply a luminosity restraint to a gradient as well, so that's why each gradient has to be on a separate layer. Okay, so let's get back to another image. Thank you for all those great questions. And again, Matthew, so I agree it kind of could be nice to have that sort of gradient on both layer. But look, if we go to this gradient, I can change the opacity, I could add a luminosity range to that gradient and so on. So it's kind of treating them separately. So blending them together might be a little bit tricky. All right, let's have a look at the next image. 1 second. Okay. Let's find another one. Here we go. Let's just get the screen back and get my face out of the way. Right, let's go for, I'm going to grab a seascape. So we've gone from city to the sea. Let's grab the unedited one, because there's a little sneaky trick here that we can do with the skin tone tool, which is quite interesting. Okay, so first of all, again, before I do anything, I like to crop and rotate. It just helps me visualize a bit better. So let's grab our crop tool up the top here. We're unconstrained, so that means we can just crop straight away. So I'm going to do something like that just to cut out a bit of the foreground. H on my keyboard for the Lightroom people out there as well. Once you have a crop applied, you don't need to tap enter or anything like that. For as long as the crop tool is selected, you will see the crop. When you deviate away from the crop cursor tool, then the image pops to its cropped area. So if I go back to the hand tool, then you see the image crops like so. So C on your keyboard for crop is good to remember. H is also good as well. So C for crop, H for hand tool. Okay, so basic edits. Let's go to my first basic tool tab. I'm going to warm this up a little bit, ever so slightly. Just a touch with the white balance. Levels wise, again, if we hit auto, let's see what happens. You see it just tucks those in ever so slightly, because there's no point having, if you like, dead space on the image. And we've got another example coming up which shows exactly how the levels works, and we can go into a bit more depth and so on. Okay, so levels are set, white balance is good, crop is okay. It's now looking sort of a bit flat and lifeless, so let's add some contrast. Now if you think, oh, I can't overdo the contrast because it's getting too dark down the bottom here, don't forget we can always lift our shadows a bit with the high dynamic range tool, but the contrast is still having an effect. So if I click on contrast, you can see before and after, like so. So let's just open up the shadows a bit more. And then good old clarity, of course. Let's throw in some clarity as well. Now already all we've done is a minor levels tweak, added some contrast, lifted the shadows and added some clarity. And we could stop there, to be honest. If we do a before and an after, that's before and that's after. So that's quite a big difference, but it's not looking over processed or anything like that, for example. If we zoom in, I think it's nice and sharp. This is from Russell Ord. He's a photographer in Australia. What was this shot with? This was on a, oh look, just a little XT2. Look at that fantastic sharpness as well. Now, because it's nice and sharp, I might just pop in a few points of structure so we can see all the water droplets as well. So let's zoom back out. And what I wanted to show you on this one was an unusual kind of use of the skin tone tool. So traditionally what the skin tone tool is used for is for equalizing skin tones. So none of us have, if you like, perfectly even skin tone, and we're not meant to have perfectly even skin tone. But of course, what the skin tone tool does is help to equalize it. Especially quite often when you're posing. I'm not a model. If I was a model, I might have my hand near my face or something like that, and the skin tone can differ quite greatly. So the skin tone tool, and that's in the color editor, let's just bring that up the top so you know what I'm talking about, helps to normalize various different skin tones. It's a really fast way to do so. But we can also use it to normalize colors on any shot. So in this example, and we can artistically argue whether we want to normalize or equalize some colors or not, but it's quite an interesting thing to look at so you know how to use it. Okay, so let's hide me for a second. And what we're going to do first of all, we're going to do a very simple mask. So we're going to grab my brush. We're going to right click to see the brush settings. So we've got size and hardness. So let's just make this a bit smaller. Start to brush. Got M on the keyboard to see the mask. So I'm just going to roughly, and it is going to be pretty rough, mask this wave here. Like so. And for a bit of additional speed, we can right click and say fill mask. And then that helps if, there we go, fill mask like so. So now we've got a mask just on the waved area. So if we go to our color tool tab and the skin tone tab, grab our color picker over here and then click on the color that we want to, if you like, our reference color. That's probably a good word. So do we want our wave to look the more sort of tealy turquoise, or do we want it to be the more bluey color? So let's say I'm going to go for the more tealy turquoise color, like so. Now you see right away we've got a selection which shows me the color range that we're going to edit. Now if we turn on view selected color range, everything will go to monochrome that is not part of the selection. But it's a bit difficult to see on this because everything is much the same color. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand this range out. And then what happens when we drag hue across, everything in that color range is going to get transformed to my picked color. So in theory, as I drag hue across, you see the more bluer tone of the wave in front has reduced. And if we go back in this direction, you can see it pop back like so. So if we want to have the same sort of tealy color, I can grab my hue, saturation and lightness to some extent to the right, but that gets rid of our contrast. But you can see now we've ended up with that sort of equal color tone from top to bottom. Now if we wanted to make it all more blue, what we could do is just pick up this dot here and then we could shift it round this aspect. And now you see we've kind of got that more bluer tone, or probably going too far to the purples, across the whole wave. So you can really normalize and control the color where you want. As I said, it was mostly useful for skin tone, but I've seen it used on seascapes, landscapes. If we've got some greens that maybe you want to normalize, it can work really nicely. Now I've kind of messed that bit up there, so I'm just going to pick my tealy tone once more and then expand that out, making sure we're covering the sort of additional blues in the waves and so on, and then bring my hue across, and then it just takes that out a little bit at the front. So again, we can argue artistically whether that's a good thing to do, but actually it works quite nicely for all kinds of different applications. So yes, Matthew, if you haven't used it before, then it's always worth experimenting with it. Now, what else could we do with this shot? Final thing, let's make a new filled layer. So let's say a new filled layer, like so. And that's a filled layer is obviously a mask over the entire image. And let's have a little play with the color editor. Sorry, the color balance tool. I didn't name my layers, naughty. So let's call this color grading. And this one was the C colors, like so. So back on this one, let's just play around a bit to, I want kind of a slightly warmer sky. So I just want to warm up the highlights a bit, not by much, like so. So if we turn this layer off, you can see before and after, just to sort of warm up the sky a tiny bit, like so. And then normally at this stage, what I do is if I go back to the background, then I might just play around a little bit more with the sort of final edits and adjustments, like so. So let's see the before. So it's Alt on your keyboard, hold down reset. So that's how it came out of camera and how it came out of camera. Lens wise, I saw someone ask, let's have a look. It is a 50 to 140. There you go, an XF 50 to 140. So Fuji people, you might know better what that means than to me as well. Leon says, awesome use of the skin tool. Thanks, Leon. Yeah, it's called the skin tone tool, but it doesn't have to be used for skin tone, of course. Saturation, I just saw that pop up on the chat from Carlo. Saturation does work more like vibrancy in Lightroom. So colors that are already more saturated, this isn't probably a good example, but colors that are already more saturated receive less treatment than those that are less saturated. So it stops the crazy colors already in the image getting oversaturated and looking ugly and so on and so forth. So it is different. Okay, no, you don't have to flatten layers, Alan, at the end. Remember, it's all non-destructive. So we're not changing the pixels in the raw file, so we don't have to flatten anything, and you do have a layer limit of also 16 layers. So just for performance versus flexibility. Okay, let's have a look in the official Q&A, and let's see. Could we also use this on the sky color? Erwin was asking. Yeah, exactly. So if you had some funny tones in the sky that you wanted to normalize, then absolutely you could do that as well. Let's see, where did I get the new option variant from the menu bar? So that's under let's do it now, so we can look at this one. So that's image, new variant, like so. So if we look in the browser, so here's our edit that we did, and then here's our original. So if I hide my browser, Command B, hide the tools, Command T or Control T if you're on PC, you can see the before and the after, like so. Okay, James says, is there any work being done to include a single before after button in Capture One? That's all a trade secret, I'm afraid. So any future stuff coming we can't talk about, but we always take your feedback very seriously as well. Alrighty, lots of Fuji people I see. It's a really cool little camera. I have got one lying around here somewhere, but the X-T2 is great. I've had a lot of fun with it recently as well. Alright, okay, so let's move on to another one before we run out of time. So let's bring my tools back. Helps if, hang on. I've got an additional window going on. I just hit a wrong shortcut key on Google, and there we go. Toolbar, tools, tools. Okay, browser. That's better. Something funny going on with my shortcuts for a second. Okay, let's find another shot that we can play with. So we've done city, we've done sea. I guess we should do something a bit more landscape-esque. So let's grab, what should we go for? Let's grab this one here, as that's not a great example of out of camera result because I took it, that's why. So normally my shots tend to need a little bit of extra work. So this is shot out in California somewhere. I think it's called Bird Rock. You can probably guess why it's called Bird Rock, but it's very flat. It's a bit underexposed. It's not very interesting. It's kind of lifeless. So first of all, let's throw on a crop just to get rid of a bit of sky and a tiny bit of foreground. And again, going back to the default adjustments, as we can see, it's very underexposed. Well done, David. So let's lift up the exposure, and it's quite cold, and that's not really representative of the time it was shot. So let's warm that up a little bit. So that's probably going to be something closer. Now looking at the levels, if we hit auto this time, then that's going to give us a better start point in terms of contrast. And the middle slider here, if we grab that, this changes our mid-tone density. So let's just drop the mid-tones down a bit like so. Already looking much better, but let's raise the shadows slightly. That's mostly for the benefit of this rock down in the front. Now let's try style actually on this one, and we're going to look at something called style layers. So here's a bunch of various different Capture One styles. So let's go for one of these, not Pacific. Which one was I trying out on this one? Let's have a look. Let's just roll down some cinematic styles and see what might look interesting. Because what I want to show you, just if you're not a big fan of styles, because not every image takes a style equally well, then what you can do, of course, is right click and apply it as a layer, which makes a style much more flexible. So this will give you a filled layer with the style applied and the ability to change the opacity. So if we find something that's maybe a bit too heavy-handed for this shot, so let's go for spectrum, which is all about color grading. So let's try some of these, see what we can like the look of. So I quite like this, but it's maybe a bit too much. So if I right click and say apply to new layer, what we end up with is a style layer with the name of the style and the ability to dial the opacity down. So that's no style all the way up to a kind of acceptable level that you might like. So really handy just to give any style a bit more flexibility. So there we've got our style layer, which we can turn on and off to see what that's doing as well. So if I go back to my background, let's just chuck in a bit more clarity. And now this is where we can talk a bit more about local adjustments and dodging and burning. Because something I do quite a lot of is exactly that, dodging and burning. I'm old enough to have worked in a dark room, unfortunately, which I don't miss at all. We were very used to selectively changing the exposure on different areas of the print. And of course, we can do that digitally with a lot more control and a lot more power now that we can do in Capture One, and of course other applications. But I think Capture One is particularly good, allowing you to do very precise dodging and burning controls. Now there's a million different ways to do it, but I'll show you what I think is the preferred method for me, at least anyway. Okay, so I want to darken down some areas and actually add a bit more contrast into Bird Rock at the back here, because it's kind of sitting in the mist, so it's losing some of its appeal, I guess. So what I'm going to do first of all is make a new filled layer. So once again, that's like an adjustment layer if you're used to Photoshop. If you're used to Lightroom, of course, then it's not really layer-esque, it's more about adjustment brushes. So now we've got a new filled layer, which I'm going to play around with some adjustments to see how I can improve what's going on in Bird Rock at the back here. So I think I want it to be more contrasty, so I'm going to increase the contrast. I'm not worried that it's ruining the rock in the front, because I'm going to selectively brush it back into this one, and I'm going to have a bit more clarity. Let's zoom in a bit so we can see how Bird Rock is looking, and I'm going to have a bit more structure, and not that much, just, well, maybe a little, have a bit more structure, more clarity, and we can even open up the shadows a tiny bit. So now if I turn that layer off, that's bird rock before and bird rock after. Now that's probably overcooking it a bit, but it's better to have too much than not enough, because we can selectively now brush this back in. So what I want to do is get rid of the mask, but keep my underlying adjustments. So layer 1, let's call this bird rock, has contrast, high dynamic range adjustment, clarity, and so on. So I want to clear my mask by right clicking, but it's going to keep all those adjustments. So clearing the mask just gets rid of the mask, but keeps all the adjustments. So you see the sliders haven't moved. So now I can grab my brush and paint it back into bird rock where I want it to be. Now there's a really important control here, which I always tend to talk about in webinars, which is the flow control. And what flow does is really control how much adjustment you're painting in each pass of the pen, or if you're using a mouse, doesn't have to be a pen, each time you brush past. So at 100, as soon as I move my brush, if I do that, let's just do that, that's going to paint in that entire adjustment. Now that doesn't look like it has any sort of level of finesse. We can almost get away with it, but that was an all or nothing introduction of that adjustment. So I'm going to say undo, so edit, undo brush, like so. And this time we're going to right click and we're going to put our flow down to something nice and low. So now flow is set to 3, which really means 3%. So every time I brush, we're going to add 3%. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. Having to do maths quickly there. So it will build up the adjustment nice and slowly. So let's make the brush a bit smaller, because it's a bit big. And around here, nice low flow. So now I can just brush back and forth in bird rock, and gradually that's going to keep increasing my contrast, structure, clarity, and so on. But when I think it's at an acceptable level, then I can stop. And if I think I've gone too far, I can just press E for erase and drop back a little bit, like so. So let's just do a bit more brushing here, like so. Let's zoom in to bird rock. That's 100%. So if I turn the layer off, then that's before. And if we turn the layer back on, that's after, like so. So just to give that a little bit of a lift, and if we zoom out, we can turn that off and turn that back on, and then you see the difference that it's made. Now if I want to, I can brush this anywhere if I think it's going to work. It might not, but we could probably do a bit in the sea, for example, and so on. If I want to lift some areas, like this rock is a bit on the dark side, we could just do a similar kind of process. So if we do new filled layer, remember filled layer, that's a mask on the entire image. If we open up the shadows, then that lifts those rocks and the brightness a bit. Right click, clear the mask, grab my brush, and then we can just daintily open up where we want to, like so. And again, it's only subtle. Can accentuate this light on the edge of the rock here, like so. So it's only subtle, but it just gives you that extra little something something. The only thing I might do now to finish is just chuck in a vignette, like so. And if I wanted to do more to this image, I don't want to spend too long on one particular shot at a time, but we could make a darken layer, we could make various parts of the sea darker, we can brighten other aspects of the sea and so on. But that's my preferred way, is to step 1, make a filled layer, visualize the adjustments, clear the mask, and then brush it back in where you want it. That gives you the biggest level of control, essentially. Okay, let's have a look at your questions, and let's see how we're going. Why does the brush have 3 concentric circles? That's because, to help you guys see, I have the cursor enlarged. But what it does, if I watch my monitor, it actually gives us 3 circles. It's only supposed to be 2. So it's just the way the cursor enlarged, it looks like it's 3. But there's only 2. It's the inner ring is where you have 100%. And by the time you've got to the outer ring, you are down to 0. So I know it looks like it has 3, but technically it only has 2. So just ignore one of those rings. Would auto mask be helpful for masking the island? That's a good question, Gordon, actually. I personally very rarely use auto mask because in this case, like if we go right up to the edge, I personally wouldn't want to cut perfectly around that island, because then I think it would be very obvious that you have you've done masking, and you don't want the viewer or yourself to see that you've masked, because then it looks unnatural. So if we actually look at this layer and we look at the grayscale mask, oh, let's go to bird rock, sorry. Let's look at the grayscale mask, like so. So that's the mask that I've put in. So it's very soft and also has varying density depending how we want to build it up. So if you cut around something perfectly, then I personally think it looks a bit too obvious. So I would rather keep it soft and subtle, and then no one knows that you've done any sneaky masking, for example. And also auto masking is quite time consuming as well. So this is a relatively quick way to do it. Okay, last question. I note you use auto for levels only. How about other auto possibilities? Actually, auto is always worth trying. Shall we try it on this one? This is where it's going to not work, isn't it? So let's do a new variant. And up here you've got the big A for auto, and you can decide what it wants to do. So let's, fingers crossed, say auto, and away we go. Now the only thing that doesn't look great on that is the white balance. So let's fix that. But once we fix the white balance, it's not actually far off, but that's a tricky one to analyze white balance wise. So if we take this one and we say auto, again, pretty good. But of course, Capture One can't anticipate how much contrast you like, or do you like flat images and so on. But it can be a good start point. So who was asking that? Robert. So don't be afraid to try auto. It can work actually really, really nicely. Alrighty. So Ali, I'm going to come back to your question about Dehaze. And there we go. And Elliot was saying a bit confused about invert and clear. Okay, so remember, invert mask will invert the mask. So if we grab a, let's just do a crappy mask like so. Helps if we can see it. So let's bring flow up. So there's a crappy mask. If we right click and invert it, it's going to flip it. So now we've got it like this. Whereas clear mask, let's just change the exposure. Whereas clear mask will just get rid of the mask but keep the underlying adjustments. And the reason why I like to do that is because then you can visualize what your adjustments are going to do at their maximum, and then brush it back in with a nice low flow so you can build it up to something that looks good. So, okay, how are we doing for time? Geez, an hour flies past quickly. So let's have a look at another image. Okay. Oh, just check our feed. Just dropped out for a second. Okay, we're back. All right. Okay, let's find another shot. Hey, if your feed just disappeared for a second, just tap the reconnect icon on your browser and you should be okay. Okay, let's go to another shot. And what I wanted to show you, I think, as I teased you about it, was this one. So let's make a new variant like so. And let's see. Okay. So a sort of city shot, and this one I wanted to talk about was to look at removing a couple of objects with layers, and also what these figures do at the top of the levels tool, excuse me. So first of all, I want to rotate this a little bit, and if you do want to just rotate a tiny bit, I find going to the lens tool tab, and if I use my cursor keys, then I can just jog the image to a tiny amount. So if I do shift cursor, we get 0.1. If we do just a cursor key, we get 0.01. So I often find, let's hide my browser, I often find that it's easier to rotate an image by a small amount just by using the cursor keys. So I'm going to settle around something like that, for example. Okay, so now looking at this shot, it's almost bang on out of camera. Now if we turn on our exposure warnings, we can see the sky is blown out. Now that could be perfectly fine, it could be a choice if we want a nice bright sky. What we could do is bring our highlights back. So if we turn on exposure warnings, then we can get that highlight detail back in the sky, and then we see the cloud detail. But what if I didn't want to see the clouds, but I wanted just a bright sky, but I didn't want it to be blown out? Now if I hover my cursor key over this area and you look at my RGB values, you can see that they're blown out essentially. So that's not necessarily great if you're going to send this to print, because what we really should have is some kind of dot or ink being laid down on the paper. So what we can do at the top of the levels tool, if we turn exposure warnings back on again, if I pull this one across, then essentially what it's doing is that it's reducing the density, but it's not bringing in quite so much highlight detail. So the highlight slider, if we bring that back up, let's turn this off, that's going to recover sort of details and so on and bring those clouds back. If we pull this one across, then that's going to darken that area down. You can see the histogram moving across, but it doesn't necessarily liberate the same amount of details, for example. So that's just useful to know that you've got that tool there in your arsenal. What it doesn't do is paint in data which doesn't exist. So if we just quickly go to this image, for example, so when I shot in Tokyo, right into the sun, probably not good for my eyes. If I try and recover this with the highlight slider, see it's blown out here, so there's nothing I can do about that. And equally, if I move the output levels slider back, you can see it's not adding in magic data or anything, so it doesn't sort of fill that area with some murky grey or something. It's just a different way of editing, if you like. Okay, let's go back to this image. Oh, Brandon, I just saw a little thing for you. The ability to turn on and off each tool. I'll show you in a second because it's entirely possible to do that. All right, so where were we? So we've done our little sky edit, for example. Let's lift the shadow slightly, add some clarity and so on, and let's just throw in a vignette. So I'm going to stop there, because what if you want to remove some of the distracting elements, like this manhole cover, for example. So we can do that in Capture One, and I would like to stress that I personally don't think that Capture One is a retouching tool. If you wanted to go mad with like removing distractions and objects and so on and so forth, Photoshop, Affinity Photo is still your sort of go-to tools, if you like. But if you want to just quickly remove some kind of annoyance in the shot, then it's obviously much quicker to do so within Capture One. So what we do then is create a heal layer like so. So that's click and hold on the plus icon. So now if I grab my brush, the icon looks slightly different. It has these little arrows around the outside, as you can see. So now I want to pick my source point. So if I hold the Alt key down, I want to copy some sort of road from here. So when I option click, I get a circle, and I want to fill that in on this section here like so. So if I press M, Let's get rid of the masks. Now that manhole cover has disappeared quite nicely. Now the caveat of using this tool is that there's only one source point per layer. So if I wanted to get rid of this manhole or hole in the road, whatever it is, technically I would have to make another layer, but I can probably get away with getting rid of it like so. Because what this manhole cover or removal, if I press M on the mask, this mask is using data from this area to get rid of it, and this mask is using data at the same vector as this one. So in this case I could get away with it, but if I wanted to get rid of this mark on the wall or whatever, then I'd have to go ahead, make a new heal layer like so, option click, and then grab it like so. So now I can get rid of that. But it's just really handy for getting rid of some of those annoying distractions. But once again, I would stress that Capture One is not a retouching tool. Now to Brandon's question about turning tools on and off. I think that was a Lightroom-esque question. If you want to disable a tool, like turn it off, you've got the reset button here. So I'm in the clarity tool down here. So the reset button will reset it to 0. If you option click, then you can preview what the tool is doing. So kind of like option clicking, the reset button does everything, and then option clicking the reset button just does the tool itself. Or the particular slider, if you click on clarity, you can see before and after as well. So it doesn't have an on-off button, but there is that sort of temporary on-off button as well. Okay, how are we doing for time? Blimey, we're nearly out of time. Linda says, why did Capture One get rid of right-click, copy, or apply adjustments? Oh, contentious subject, that one. So in Capture One 12, we cleaned up a lot of the menus, and we rearranged a lot of things to make it more logical. In the browser menu, when you right-click, a whole bunch of stuff came up, and we took out some of those things. Now, one of those things that went out was copy, which I agree was maybe not the smartest choice. But don't forget, who is that? Asker Linda. You can also use a shortcut as well. So you can say copy adjustments. By default, it's Shift Command C, apply Shift Command V. If we go to edit, you can always edit those keyboard shortcuts to anything you want to, instead of the default. So if you have a completely different shortcut that makes more sense for copy and apply, you can edit in the edit keyboard shortcuts. We might have time for one more, but I'm just going to chuck up a poll on screen because I see, I don't know if this is going to work actually. Let's say, oh, it didn't work. Hang on a minute. Let's say start polling. So you should see a poll on screen in a second. If you can answer that, that would be awesome. Because I think there's a few of you using Lightroom on here, so that kind of would be interesting to know, actually, just out of interest to see what people are using. And if you are using Lightroom, thanks for sort of giving up your time as well for joining this, because I know it's difficult following a webinar on an application when it's not something you use all the time. So thank you a great deal for spending the time and coming along as well. And I hope also what you've been seeing is interesting as well and not too overwhelming for a brand new application as well. Okay, I'm just going to close that poll down now because that gives me a good indication. And let's just see, we are kind of almost out of time, but maybe we can do something really super fast that maybe doesn't need a lot of editing. So let's do our taxi. So we're going to do this speed edit as well. So let's hit C for crop, and let's just make this slightly more dynamic. So I'm going to crop like so. H to hide the crop. Let's open up the brightness ever so slightly. Now I want the taxi to be brighter, but I don't want to brighten this area anymore. So let's just throw in a quick grad, draw linear gradient mask, and then I'm going to start drawing here, and finish around here. Alt key to make it asymmetric. So I just want to pull it out a bit. Whoops, fumbled fingers. Let's do that again. So something around there. Let's hold my Alt key down. Make this a bit more asymmetric and then grab this one out. That's better. And then finally, let's open up the exposure. Maybe not exposure, let's try brightness. Just so it's ever such a bit brighter. And what I can do, we can do our balance and act. If we go to the background, let's make that darker. And then go back to our taxi and then lighten him up a bit. And throw in a bit of vignetting and some clarity. If you want to switch to the background layer quickly, you've got your fast switcher up here, and you can also throw that on a shortcut, and away we go. So there we go, speed edit. So if we hold our Alt key down and click on reset, that's before and after. So just a tiny little balancing act. Jose says, what do I need to do? So he answers my question about straightening. What was it? There is tons of questions in the Q&A. So I can't necessarily answer all of them. So Jose, just copy paste it quickly in there, and I'll try and answer it. Auto straightening. So there is auto straightening only works with phase one backs because we read the tilt sensor. So I assume you're talking about this one here, rotation. So that won't work if it's not a phase one back, because I know cameras have rotation sensors, but it's a metadata we pick up from the phase one cameras only, but maybe it could be possible to pick it up from other cameras. So that's a good idea. So that could be a nice thing to add for the future. So before we have to go, I just saw a couple of questions about, where are we? Where is it? Oh, I lost it. You're a really nice chatty bunch. So there was a question which went and has gone from my head. So there we go. Anyway, I just look at the last few in the Q&A and we see it. How to level the image relative to the horizon. That's actually a good one to close on, because that happens, of course, a lot in landscape photography. So let's take... I thought I had another wavy shot here that was good. Let's take this one because it's ever so slightly off, I think. Grab the straighten cursor tool. So that's this one at the top. And then we draw along our horizon like so. And then when we let go, it will auto rotate about that point. So it's just the straighten cursor tool up here. And really, in terms of emulating Dehaze, there's actually probably not enough time for that, Ed, but there is an older webinar where we actually do go through that. But to be honest, if I can find the image, we could do it really quickly, if you don't mind hanging around. Scroll, 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 scroll. Probably if you've joined a webinar before, you're sick of seeing the shot. But let me see if I can find it. So this one here. So we got this shot, looks hazy. I'm sure you'll agree. So if we go to our levels tool and say auto, still kind of hazy. So let's make a new variant like so. Let's go to our preferences. And we're going to change our channel mode to red, green and blue. And what this does when we do auto levels, it will do it independently for each color channel. So now if I say auto, and if we look at the previous one, which is, we got so many variants, hang on. So we have this one, which we did with our second levels, and let's just say a new variant like so. And then this one, we're going to go back to our preferences. Let's go back to normal RGB mode and say auto. So this was the second RGB mode, and this was the first one. So you see that kind of blue haziness like so. That's eradicated quite nicely by changing in the preferences the channel mode to red, green and blue, like so. And of course what you can also do, if we go into this one, we can look in the blue channel, and then we can also play around a bit with the levels on the blue in particular. And to be honest, a bit of clarity and a bit of contrast tends to get rid of a lot of the haze. But generally flat, hazy looking images are down to kind of quite a narrow histogram, and simply just playing with the levels or auto levels can often get rid of it as well. Alrighty, now we should probably finish after all that. So sorry that was a bit rushed, Ed, but you can play around with that yourself as well. And thanks for everyone who was so nice on the chat and helping out other people as well. That was really really refreshing and nice to see, actually. So that was fantastic. And yes, the sky is a bit hazy, Jeff, but what I'd do a gradient mask at the top here, and then probably tweak the white balance a little bit. That would be a simple way. It's colder here, so gradient mask, warm it up slightly, probably problem solved, like so. Remember, with the Dehaze slider, there's not so much control, it's just one slider. So with the various tools in Capture One, you can kind of shape exactly the look that you want as well. All right, now I'm going to go, I promise. All right, so I'll leave the chat window up for a little bit longer, but I will disappear and hide the screen and so on. So the recording will go up Friday, probably, and it's always at learn.captureone.com as well. So learn.captureone.com. You can always find webinars, tutorials and everything there. And I see Thomas has posted a Dehaze tutorial, which I think was from a guy called Thomas Fitzgerald. And if it is that one, that's also pretty good as well. All right, guys and ladies, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and hope to see you all again soon. So take care. See you soon. Bye.